Today we'll continue our journey through the book of Deuteronomy. We've been looking at this marvelous book, this farewell discourse of Moses to the people. We've been talking about chapter 7. And in chapter 7 of the book of Deuteronomy, we learn the importance of the law. Earlier in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses shared the Ten Commandments with us, and he talked about the importance of the law. Chapter 7 kind of brings that out a little bit more in the sense that when the Israelites are obedient to the law of God, when they do God's will, when they follow what God wants, Moses says, then they will prosper. But if they kind of turn away from God's law, if they forget the commandments, if they just kind of go their own way, then what happens is a kind of a selfishness, a narrowness envelops them. They lose sight of other people, they lose sight of the needs of other people, and they just get into a sense of trying to acquire for themselves. And frequently we see this pattern in life. We see the fact that God's law keeps us centered on the idea of not only giving praise to God and acknowledging God, and having a love for God, but also, and very importantly, to show that that's real, to have a love for neighbor. And so it kind of takes us out of ourselves and it says, well, what does my neighbor need? How can I help my neighbor? And so Moses emphasizes in the book of Deuteronomy the importance of us doing that, of us following God's law and reaching out to others. Israel really was not worthy, Moses says, on its own merits, but it was chosen by God out of love. A lot of times we ask the question, well, why are the Israelites, why are the Jewish people God's chosen people and not somebody else? Well, it kind of seems unfair of God that he just chose the Jewish people to reveal who God is to them and kind of give them the commandments and all of that. And we say, well, why did God do it that way? And you can say, well, it was because of the outstanding character of the Jewish people. They were just so wise, and so God chose them. And Moses says, oh no, that's not the idea. The idea is that God chose the Jewish people out of love, and through choosing them has chosen all of humanity. It's not a restrictive choice. It's not well, I've only chosen the Jewish people and I don't care about anybody else. So I've chosen the Jewish people to express my love through them to all of humanity. So we have a love of God, a love of neighbor, and the love of neighbor is not just a love of the Jewish neighbor. It is not a restrictive love. Well, I can only love my neighbor who is Jewish. No. God says quite clearly it is a love for all. So God has chosen out of love, and God sustains us in love, and God assists us in our loving. And it's interesting how Moses puts it. It's a very unusual phrase. It's the idea that the Jewish people are the property of God. You might say it's kind of a strange way to think of a relationship. They are the property. But property, of course, is very important in the cultural context. Your property meant that this was especially yours, that you had to take care of your property, that you had to show a special concern for your property. You had to be conscientious with regard to your property. And so it's in that sense that the Jewish people are God's property. God has a special love for them, and as I said, through them, through all of humanity. And then as we journey on into chapter 8 of the book of Deuteronomy, the discussion turns to the 40 years that the Jewish people have spent in the desert. 40 is a symbolic number. We don't know the exact number of years. It could have been a few years, could have been 10 years. We don't know the exact uh, number because this number 40 is frequently used in terms of it was a while, it was a long time. So the 40 years are described as a test. So the idea that God put the people through a test. And the sense was, well, they had this journey. They were liberated out of Egypt. God assisted them. They came out of Egypt. God assisted them in the desert with the manna, with the quail. God fed them. God led them. God was present as a cloud. God was present as a fire. God was there. God revealed to Moses. In all of those ways, God was present. But the testing is our faithfulness to the relationship. And it's similar to, I think, testing that we go through in our lives all the time, isn't it? Will we be faithful in our relationships? We look back and we say that was a test. When we're going through it, we sometimes don't think of it as a test. We think of it as the everyday working out of that relationship. Will I be faithful in times of stress? When things are going easy, sometimes people say, well, it's easy to be faithful. Everything seems fine. But when there are bumps in the roads, when there's confusion, when there's miscommunication, when there's illness, when there's struggle, when there's death, when there's all these challenges in life that we have to cope with, the sense is, will I be faithful in those times? And so we try to kind of hold on to that and yet be faithful in that relationship. Not abandon the relationship, not give up, not stop trying. We try to be as faithful as we can to the other person. And of course, there are times when a relationship has to end. There are times when there is abuse involved, and we say, well, this is wrong. The person needs help. If they don't, get help, we can't stay in a cycle of abuse. There are those types of situations, obviously, that we have to deal with, and very difficult situations to deal with. But there's a sense that to be faithful is important in a relationship, that sustains a relationship, that faithfulness. Faithfulness even when there are trials and difficulties. Sometimes we see it with parents who are dealing in very hard situations with their children. And they try to be faithful. They need, of course, tough love. They need accountability. But they try to be faithful to their child. They try to help their child and guide their child. And so Moses stresses the importance of this test that the people went through. Because there were tough times in the desert. The manna, the quail, lack of water at times, difficult living conditions in the desert. All of these things were hard for the people. They were a challenge. And you could see why the people wanted to go back to Egypt. Maybe things were a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more certain. They knew where they stood. The slavery was hard, but they knew where they stood there. And they coped. But now in the desert, what's going to happen? Where am I going to live? I'm moving my tent from day to day. It's hot. It's sandy. There are hard things to deal with. And so we look back upon that, and Moses says that's a test. But at the time, what do we think of? We think of, well, God has made a promise. My hope is that God is going to be faithful to that promise. And that's where I place my hope. And so we see the struggles that the people go through. We look back and we say, test. We look at the struggles that we've gone through. And we look back and we say, well, that was a test. And when I survived that test, I actually became stronger. And next time we will continue our journey through chapter 8 of the book of Deuteronomy. God bless.